When it comes to season 2 of The Rings of Power, it's been pretty disappointing so far. I mean, they've made a lot of the same mistakes they did in season 1. The plot just moves painstakingly too slow, characters lack any real depth, and when it comes to the overall show, it's 5 seasons, and it feels like they are just sort of trying to stretch it out as much as they can. And so now we move into episode 5, which is titled Halls of Stone. And a positive from this episode, we get no Harfoot storyline, no Isildur storyline, hardly any of Galadriel, so that's a great bonus. And also, it actually focuses on the main 2 storylines which have any interest, those being the Dwarf storyline and also Sauron and Celebrimbor storyline. The first thing we see in this episode is King Durin putting on that Ring of Power, and throughout the episode we see how that affects him. We see him go into the mine and he says to dig where there's a foundation wall, and so of course Prince Durin is quite cautious about digging in that area, but the ring guides him on where to dig and to bring back the light to Khazad-dûm. The king takes matters into his own hands by demanding the axe from Prince Durin, and he digs at the wall himself. And as we can see here, the ring did guide the king well of where to dig, and so straight away the king has a positive connection with the ring. We then see a few of the other successful digs, and I thought this was a decent start to the episode, but then they ruin it a little bit with this line here. So yeah, that whole Khazad-dûm thing just didn't feel like it had a place here. It felt more attuned to something you would see at a football match. And so yeah, I don't know really why they added this in the scene. We then see Celebrimbor have a little speech with the dwarves, and then they reveal the Doors of Durin. We then see Celebrimbor speak to Sauron, and Sauron's not so happy because Celebrimbor's speech went on a bit longer than he wanted because he encouraged Celebrimbor to keep it short. And so you get a few bits like this which are a bit like a married couple having a bit of a tiff. This conversation then proceeds with Sauron saying how he wants to create the 9 rings for the men, and Celebrimbor being cautious on this because of how easily they can be corrupted. And even saying how they should probably stop where they are now because, you know, they've already made enough rings of power. Why go any further and risk a failure? And so with Sauron and Celebrimbor not seeing eye to eye on this, Sauron storms off and says that he'll make the 9 himself. And he has quite a good face here, actually, of sort of like a kid going to his room saying, you know, I don't even need you, Dad. I'm going to go and just do this on my own. Next up, we're over to Numenor, and we see Pharazôn, who is now in control here after the whole eagle situation in one of the previous episodes, where all the people were chanting, Pharazôn, Pharazôn, Pharazôn. He talks with his dickhead son for a little bit about how the age of men is upon us, sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen with what we just spoke about with the whole Sauron and the rings for men. And this next bit just made me chuckle a little bit because they're still chanting Pharazôn. They're still chanting Pharazôn, Pharazôn. All night long they're going to chant Pharazôn's name, bloody hell.
Listen to them.
We then have a brief conversation between Miriel and Elendil, and Elendil wants to fight back this whole Pharazôn takeover. Elendil also discusses what he saw in the Palantir and that he was lost and he was running away, as you can see here, on horseback away from the city. Keeping with Numenor, we then see those who are still loyal to the Queen stripped of their rank, and that's all down to this woman here, Irien, who is the daughter of Elendil. How has she gained that authority? Well, that's because she helped with the whole overthrowing the Queen when she revealed the Palantir, and that she, you know, put all her trust into that, and that caused her brother Isildur to die, as she knows at this point. So Elendil hands over his sword, but as we see with the people in a minute, they are still very loyal to him as captain, and it becomes a bit like a Dead Poet Society scene here.
Thank you, Captain. How do you think this ends? Silence!
Captain, my captain.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson.
And ending this portion of Numenor, we then see Pharazôn approach the Palantir. We then head over to High King Gil-galad, who receives a letter from Celebrimbor, who states that all is well in Eregion, and he hesitates here listening to the ring, and with the elf behind him stating that, why are we hesitating? You know, why are you putting all your trust into the ring when our enemy grows in Mordor? We then go back to Prince Durin and Disa, and they're out buying a tuning crystal, while they eventually buy it after doing a bit of haggling with the store vendor, and then she does drop the crystal, which takes her to a place where we hear a creature trembling. It's also worth mentioning that this dwarf here does reveal that for every coin spent, another goes to the crown as part of something called a ring tribute, which shows off the king's greed. When we hear the creature roar, it does scare Disa, and she drops the crystal and it smashes. And for those who saw the tease at the end of season 1, we all know it's a Balrog. Even if you didn't see that, you'll probably assume it's going to be a Balrog. As we know, there are 7 rings for the 7 Dwarven Lords, and as we can see here, King Durin is hosting a pretty scrumptious looking meal to explain that to the different factions of the dwarves. Due to the power of the ring, the king now sees all of Khazad-dûm for its glory and knows that there's more gold to be discovered, and even wants to delve much deeper to go and find it. So Khazad-dûm never has to worry ever again to be relying on other people, and even wants to break his own restrictions on this. The power of this ring is even more exemplified here when we see that he's took off the ring because he said that his hand was feeling heavy. Prince Durin then comes in to plead with his father to say not to delve deeper into the mines because these have just heard the creature that is evil, ancient and powerful, as he states here, and that they should not risk their lives for this. Prince Durin even begs for Na'vi the dwarf not to go, but the king states that he has his orders and he does follow the said orders. Next up, we go back to Eregion and see Mirandir have one of the rings on, and she's causing quite a bit of chaos because she's seeing a vision of the Balrog. And there's one thing here which did make me scratch my head.
Look out!
Wait, why? Why is an anvil being held up in the sky like that? That's a weird place to store your anvils, isn't it? So what has been going on here with these rings? Well, they said they sought to fortify the alloy by adding more mithril, and Celebrimbor was like, no, you should have done this, ... And Sauron wants to know what that is, but then he's actually interrupted by someone at the door who says that Prince Durin is here to speak about the rings. Prince Durin explains to Celebrimbor his concerns about his father and the use of the ring, and how that now he's not going to give over the rings unless the Dwarf Lords promise him half a share of their mines, yet again stating how his greed is taking over. Prince Durin then questions Celebrimbor about how much he actually knows Anatar, and Celebrimbor for the first time is like, Anatar, he's the best person ever. You're saying he could be evil? Poppycock. Sauron then continues his manipulation, but this time with Mirandir, saying how Celebrimbor is going to be vulnerable to the shadow, and that's what she was seeing in terms of her darkness when she had the ring on. Not only that, but he also has a bit of time to flirt with her, and says how she reminds him of Lady Galadriel, and I think she seems quite happy with that comparison. We then go back to Numenor, and we have this dickhead here who wants to shut down this shrine, and a whole fight then breaks out between him and this character who has a name, but I never have learnt his name. He was in season 1, and yeah, unfortunately, he dies. And don't tell me you were shocked by this, because this is probably one of the most telegraphed deaths ever.
Our captain.
No! Everybody really liked him!
We then once again head back to Eregion, and Celebrimbor states that there's something wrong with the Dwarven rings, and we get this line here from Sauron saying, just be mindful someone is not manipulating you, which is great coming from him. Sauron suggests that perhaps the issue with the rings is because Celebrimbor did them in secret and decepted the High King Gil-galad, and that he should go back there and confess the truth, but then he has 2 options, whether he does that and then he'll never be able to forge anything again, or, as Sauron says, they plunge forward and do the next 9 rings. Going back to Khazad-dûm, and the king says that he needs his son by his side, and Prince Durin does accept that, but then he goes to Deezer and says that he's tried with his father, tried to convince him about the rings, and he swears that he will never wear any of them in the future, but will he keep that promise? And now for the final part of the story in Eregion for this episode, we have Celebrimbor speaking to the elves and saying how they failed with the 7, and they're going to now bring balance to the entire project with the 9. After that speech with the elves, we see Celebrimbor here looking at his hands and looking very guilty about what he's about to do with the rings, and that he feels like he's so far deep now into this Rings of Power business. To conclude this episode, we first see the orcs approach Eregion. It then jumps straight over to Elrond, who speaks with High King Gil-galad, saying how they have to go and help Eregion, but he says no because he says that their armies can't defeat both Adar and Sauron. And then in the final moment, we see Galadriel get released from her prison. She attempts to kill Adar, and he says that we share a common enemy, that being, of course, Sauron. So yeah, overall, I thought this was easily the best episode of Season 2, possibly even the best episode of Rings of Power in total, because we focused a lot here on Sauron and Celebrimbor and the dwarves, and these storylines have been the best ones. They move at a decent pace, they're quite interesting, especially, of course, with Sauron. That is the main point of the show, the Rings of Power. Numenor stuff, I don't really care that much about Numenor, but it was okay. Things didn't drag as much as they have done in the past. Still, though, considering that this is episode 5 out of an 8-episode season, it doesn't fix the issues from the first 4 episodes, and there's still many issues from there which we might still see in the later 3 episodes of this season. And there's still plot lines like with the Isildur one and the Half-Foots, which really did become a drag in those first 4 episodes. So, you know, I think this is definitely a positive for the show, this episode, but it doesn't mean that it's still worth the watch when it comes to a total package. The death we got in this episode with Valandil really does drive home the point about season 1 of Rings of Power having many issues with it, because he was in a lot of that season, but I don't care about him. I don't care he died. Same with like Bronwyn. There's all these characters that are also flat and one-dimensional, so if they do die, it's just like, okay, cool, whatever. But that's bad, you know, in a show like this, where you have a lot of hours with these characters, you actually want to feel something about them. Otherwise, when we do get to those action scenes, I'm not going to feel like I'm really involved with it, because I don't really care if anyone does die. And for some characters like Galadriel and Elrond, I know they survive anyway. And the most interesting thing I found from this episode was seeing the Rings of Power in action. Seeing it with Mirandir, but more specifically with the King. But this is where the issue comes with Rings of Power, because there's so many different storylines they're trying to tell at one time. It'd been great if we had this sort of stretched out over a few more episodes, but instead there's no time for it to breathe, because they're trying to cram it all into one, because of course next episode, or episode 7, they're going to have to focus on Nori and all that lot. So that's been one of the big issues. There's so much, trying to stretch it all too thinly, and so it all becomes more weak when it comes to the actual characters and what we're seeing on screen. So yeah, positive chapter in a show that has dug itself a massive hole, and it'll still have to do quite a lot to pull itself up to get it to anywhere near the level of quality I think it needs to be when it comes to representing a Lord of the Rings franchise. But what were your thoughts on episode 5 and Rings of Power season 2 as a whole? Let me know all that down below. And if you fancy watching another video on screen, I have a couple of my recent reviews.